Well, we've been talking about the covenants for 2-3 sessions now, and sometimes people would ask me, and I would ask myself, so what? I mean, how is this relevant to us? Well, I hope that as we've looked at Jeremiah 31 through 34, as we looked at 2 Corinthians 3, as we have looked at Hebrews chapter 8, that you have seen the relevance of what it means to be in covenant relationship with God. And Yeshua himself said, with regard to the new covenant, in that final Pesach, when he took the third cup, he said, "This is the blood of the new covenant." At least that's how Luke records his words. What does it mean that this was the cup of the new covenant? This is the blood, my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many. It means that everything that needed to be accomplished in order for the new covenant to be entirely fulfilled and brought to full fruition was going to be accomplished by Yeshua in his death and his resurrection. And so we know for certain that this is going to happen. We have confidence that the full outplay of the new covenant, which includes the restoration of the house of Israel and the house of Judah. I know that at times, as we look at the news and we see what's going on, we think, is it possible? Is Israel going to be able to maintain? I mean, it seems like so many enemies are lining up on the borders and so forth and so on. And we should be concerned, and we should pray, and we should seek the shalom of Jerusalem. But we need not be at all fearful, because God will have the victory. And Yeshua will come. And he will fight for her. And they will look upon the one who is pierced. And there will be a revival. That will be one last great revival amongst the people of Israel. Now, what is our identity in these covenants? Let's talk a minute about identity in Israel. And I know, the difficulty is the terminology, isn't it? Sometimes these words, as we've talked about already, they change somewhat in terms of how they're used and the meaning of them through time. When we talk about Israel today, we think of a land that has a flag and has athletes at the Olympics right now, and we think of Israel as this modern nation. Of course, we know that Israel is the name of an individual, right? Jacob, his name was changed to Israel. And so the sons of Israel become the sons of, or are the sons of Jacob. We discover that the first time that the word Israel is used on a national basis is as we're preparing to hear the Exodus story, where Moshe says God says to Moshe that he's supposed to say to Pharaoh, "Israel is my firstborn." Now, he's not talking about the man Jacob. He's talking about this now constituted people, a nation of Israel. It goes back to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And so from the patriarchs, we have the nation of Israel, which are the covenant people. God has not made covenant with any other nation as he has made covenant with Israel. Now, I'm talking about, and I recognize there's two levels here. There's a, can we say, this world level, and there is an eternal level, okay? In terms of national entity in this world, God has made covenant with no other nation but Israel. Israel is God's covenant chosen people. And this is true of all of Israel, regardless of whether they have come to faith in Yeshua or not. Now, Paul hints at this in Romans 11, when he says that there are those natural branches which have been broken off because of unbelief. But he says, don't be arrogant against the branches. Because if they are broken off, it's easy for God to graft them back in. I suppose someone looking at Paul when he was Shaul and persecuting those who were followers of Yeshua might have well thought, here's a branch that's broken off. And might have thought that there was no hope for this guy who had such anger and angst against those who were followers of Yeshua. But what happened? What happened to Paul? He got grafted back in, didn't he? He came into that remnant within Israel. Paul writes in Romans 9, verse 6, not all Israel is Israel. Not everyone descended from the man Israel constitutes the real Israel, the Israel as God intends. He says, but there has always been in every generation a remnant, those who have believed God's word, those who have put their faith in God's Messiah. So there is the remnant of Israel that is within the whole of the national people of Israel. Everyone within this covenant nation partakes of the temporal blessings. What are some of the temporal blessings of Israel? I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. Actually, it says, I will curse the one who curses you. In the language, it seems to appear that there should be less who curse than those who bless. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse the one who curses you. I will make your name great. I will multiply you, and so forth and so on. So the temporal blessings accrue to everyone that are part of the covenant people. The eternal blessings, however, accrue only to those who are within the remnant. No one who has physical lineage to Jacob is going to be able to stand before God and say, I deserve to have a place in the world to come because I'm descended from Jacob. That is not going to be enough. Yeshua said, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. Nobody comes to the Father but by me. And I think it's quite obvious that there are times when Paul says that to rely upon the flesh is condemnation. What he means by flesh is one's ethnicity. We know, as I said yesterday, that there were those who believed that simply because they were constituted as the descendants of Jacob, that they certainly were standing righteous before God. We know that there were false shepherds in the time of Jeremiah who were saying, look, don't worry about it. Peace, peace. It's not a problem. God made a promise to us. He's got to keep the promise. It's no problem. And Jeremiah says, no, they're saying peace, peace when there is no peace. So the elect from the nations, those that come to faith from the nations, are they separate as the people of God? I don't think so. I think Paul's metaphor in Romans 11 of the olive tree tells us that there's one tree. He doesn't have an olive tree here and a peach tree over here. Paul's view of the people of God is that there is one people of God with one shepherd, with one faith, with one hope, with one mikveh. Right? Mikveh means baptism. Yeah, exactly. Perfect. One going into the water, however you want to say it. One Lord, one Spirit, one body. All of these metaphors are used to say that God has one people. I believe that the Scriptures clearly teach that the elect from the nations join the remnant via faith. You know, I've never heard a lot of messages on why in the world Paul goes to such great lengths to explain that Abraham is our father. Who cares if Abraham is our father if Jesus is our Savior? Why does it matter? Why does he spend that time in Romans chapter 4 that say that Abraham is not only the father of those who are circumcised and believe, but he is the father of all those who are uncircumcised? He's using those two terms to mean Jew and non-Jew. Why is it important that Abraham is the father of us all, as he says? Because salvation is to be found in that covenant relationship with God. That covenant that he promised to Abraham. He says in Galatians chapter 3, verse 8, the gospel was preached beforehand to Abraham when it was said, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. The blessing of the nations is in the covenant of Abraham. Unfortunately, what has come about throughout the millennia is that God has two different people he has, or some would say he has only one, and it used to be Israel, and now it's the church. Paul's perspective is that it isn't that the Jews get saved and come into the church, as we think of the church. It's that those Jews who have true faith in Yeshua remain in the covenant, and those who are wild olive branches get grafted into that covenant. Our identity is with Israel. Can you therefore see how incongruous it is to be replacement in our theology or to be anti-Semitic in our theology? That'd be like drilling holes in the bottom of the boat to prove that you're different. Yeah, okay, you would be. God did not start something new by abandoning Israel and forming a new people. Salvation is always within the covenant people of Israel. Now, some people are going to say, wait a minute, Tim. That sounds like replacement. Like we're replacing, like we come in and we become Israel, and that sounds too much like... No, we don't replace Israel. We don't replace the remnant. We enlarge the remnant. Didn't Zechariah say that there's coming a day when the nations will be joined to the Lord and he will call them his people? Yes. Israel is made up of the elect from Jacob and from the nations. We see this illustrated at the Exodus. Who came out of Egypt? A multitude. And what were they? They were mixed. There was a mixed multitude. And that mixed multitude stood at the foot of Sinai, and God made a covenant with them, and they said, all that you have said we will do. Now, we didn't do that, did we? But still, that covenant was made with far more than simply the physical offspring of Jacob. In the final victory, all Israel will be saved. And this means that there's going to be an awakening upon the physical offspring of Jacob. So that remnant is going to continue to grow and grow and grow until such time as it's going to encompass the whole. Let's see if we can kind of graph this out. Let's say that this represents, the red square represents the chosen people of Jacob. And let's say that this other square represents the elect from the nations, all within the same frame, God's covenant people, Israel. Now, there are those who have received Messiah, both Jew and Gentile, and this is the faithful remnant. And what's going to happen is that remnant's going to continue to grow and grow and grow and include, ultimately, the nation of Israel. So this other portion represents those who have not received Yeshua as Messiah. What has happened in the history of the Christian church is that there is this trying to sever those Gentiles and a few Jews who have accepted Yeshua away from the nation of Israel. In the theology of the emerging Christian church, salvation was viewed as separate from Israel. All of a sudden, the emerging Christian church said, we are the ones. If you want salvation, you got to come into our covenant. Of course, Roman Catholicism makes this very clear. You cannot be saved apart from being a member of the Catholic Church. Is salvation of the church or is salvation of Israel, from Israel? Is salvation from the Jews? No, we can dispute what that text means, but nonetheless. Do you get the picture? What I'm trying to say is that we need to rethink our identity. Not our ethnic identity, but our identity within the people of God. Too often we look at, in our times, we say, what's your, in your faith, what's your identity? I'm a Baptist. I'm a Presbyterian. I'm Assemblies of God. I'm a Methodist. I'm this, I'm that. Well, what we discover in the Scriptures is that the people of God is Israel. And we are grafted into, or remain within, that people of Israel. We can look at it a different way, and that is in this kind of and I'm trying to give you a visual expression, all right? Is Israel called the servant of the Lord? The answer is yes. In the book of Isaiah, Israel, the nation, is called the servant of the Lord. He says, who is as blind as my servant? He's talking about Israel. He's talking about disobedient Israel. But what else do we discover in the book of Isaiah, for instance? We discover that the Messiah is the servant of the Lord, who is the perfect representation of Israel. He's the servant of the Lord, as Israel is supposed to be. And so Isaiah goes back and forth between the servant of the Lord referring to the nation of Israel and the servant of the Lord referring to the Messiah. That's Yeshua. Those who have rejected the Messiah remain within that confine of God's covenant people. They're broken branches. God is still maintaining his faithfulness even to disobedient Israel. Why? Because he said the calling and the election is without reproach. But what does it mean? Why does Paul use this phrase so much? And we could go on and on about this, but I want to get to the covenants as a whole. Paul's theology, some have said, could be summed up in the phrase in Christ or in Messiah. We know that he uses it most of all of the authors of the apostolic scriptures. What does in Messiah mean? In one sense, it means to be in Israel. Why? Because Yeshua is the quintessential Israelite. He is all that Israel is supposed to be. He is the servant of the Lord par excellence. Therefore, the point that I'm making is that if we are in Yeshua, if we are believers in Yeshua, we are bound together in the same covenant, Jew and Gentile alike, so that Paul can say, with regard to covenant membership, there's neither Jew nor Gentile. There's neither male nor female. It doesn't matter about your gender. It doesn't matter about your ethnicity. It doesn't even matter about your economic status. There's bond and there's free. We are one in the Messiah. Those who are in Yeshua, remain in, or are grafted in, are that remnant of Israel. So which covenant is being stressed? If Israel is God's covenant people, which covenant are we talking about? The Abrahamic covenant? I could say Noahic. We could have started with that, but that obviously involves everybody. So I'm saying, what about the Abrahamic? What about the Mosaic, the Sinai covenant? Is the Abrahamic covenant and the Sinai covenant opposed to each other? Some of the reformers said so. Some of the reformers said that the Sinai covenant was a covenant of works, and the Abrahamic covenant was a representative of the covenant of redemption. I don't know if you've looked at some of that theology or not. What about the Davidic covenant? The covenant made with David that there would be a descendant of his sitting on the throne forever. What about the new covenant? Biblically, however, what I want to try to show you is that the covenants are a unified whole describing God's relationship with his chosen people. Before I go on to this point, what does Paul say in Galatians 3? A later covenant does not nullify a former covenant. Covenants build upon each other. They're in unity with each other. They're not opposing each other. One of the questions that I asked way back when I was in seminary, they do use the word covenant. However, more often than not, rather than the word covenant, they use the word promise, where we would expect them to use the word covenant. Why have they changed and substituted the word promise, epangelia in the Greek, for the word covenant, diatheke? Let me show you a few examples. Acts 13:32. And we preach to you the good news of the promise made to the fathers. Why not the covenant made to the fathers? Acts 26:6. And now I am standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. The promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly serve God day and night. And for this hope, O king, I am being accused by the Judeans. Romans 4:13. For the promise to Abraham, why not the covenant? Or to his descendants that he would be heir of the world was not through the Torah, but through the righteousness of faith. Galatians 3:18. For if the inheritance is based upon Torah, it is no longer based upon a covenant. What? No, what? Promise, but God has granted it to Abraham by means. Didn't he grant it to Abraham by means of a covenant? Yes. Why does Paul substitute the word promise? Ephesians 2:12. Remember that you were at that time separate from the Messiah. He's talking to the Gentile believers, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the, be careful, look at your English Bible sometime and see if you want to pencil this in the margin. You should if it's not already there. It doesn't say the covenants of promise. It says the covenants of the promise. Notice something. Covenants, plural, of the promise, singular. Having no hope and without God in the world. Why would the apostles have substituted the word promise for the more common word covenant? They realized, I believe, the goal of all the covenants was the Messiah. The promise is the promise of the Messiah and all that he would accomplish. The promise of the Messiah is therefore the unifying theme, linking all the covenants together in a unifying whole. The covenants don't fight each other. The covenants are a way for God to show and reveal how he's going to bring about all that he intends for his people. So they give the progressive revelation of the promise, the coming of the Messiah, and God's way of salvation. Have you ever done a study of the covenants together? It's a great study. I commend it to you. You say, well, where would I find that? Well, you have to read the Bible. You start with Genesis and you'll find the covenants made with Noah. You'll find the covenants made with Abraham. You'll find, then you go on into Exodus and you'll find the covenant made through Moses at Sinai. And then you keep reading and reading and reading and finally you'll get to 2 Samuel 7 and you'll find the covenant that God made with David. And you keep reading and reading and you'll find other covenants. You'll find covenants eventually, the new covenant in Jeremiah. So the covenants are woven all the way through. And once you study the covenants, you'll begin to recognize covenant language. Oh, that relates to the Abrahamic covenant. Oh, that relates to the Sinai covenant. It weaves the whole Bible together. We also recognize that God's covenant with Israel is eternal. Successive covenants do not replace previous ones. Each covenant joins the former to bring the promise. It's not quite like this. This isn't really quite a good illustration, but I have a little bit of the Olympics in my mind because we were watching them before we came here to Canada. And you watch the relays. You know, when they're passing a baton, it kind of reminds me of the covenants. One covenant passes to the next and passes that promise on. The way it's not quite the same is if every relay person continued to run the whole race until all of them finished at the end. That would be a little better illustration of what I'm saying about the covenants. It says in Psalm 105, He has remembered His covenant forever, the word which He commanded to 1,000 generations, the covenant which He made with Abraham and His oath to Isaac. Then He confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. That means it doesn't go away. It's forever. So the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. A perpetual covenant. How well I remember way back when I was still in seminary, and one of the nights I guess I got my studying done early and actually went to bed at a time when my wife was still awake. And she was reading her Bible. And she would sometimes say, I'm really glad I'm married to a theologian because I have so many questions. And so I crawled into bed, and she said, Tim, I have a question. I said, okay, what? She says, well, where is that verse that says that the Sabbath is changed to Sunday? And I said, oh, sweetheart, no, there's not a verse like that. She said, no. Well, maybe it's not exactly says that, but where it says that the Saturday is no longer the day that we worship, but Sunday is. Well, where is that? I said, sweetheart, it's not there. And she said, you mean one of the 10 Commandments we're not doing, and where's the verse that says we shouldn't do this anymore? I said, it's not that easy. It's more complicated than that. She said, what's so complicated about it? If God said we should keep the Sabbath, then why don't we keep the Sabbath? And I sighed a big sigh, because I had been struggling with this for numbers of months. And I said, sweetheart, I don't know. I'm too tired to think about it now, but I'll work on it, and I'll get you an answer later. And blessed be the Lord, my wife is of the type that she wants to know, and she's not going to let it go. A few days later, did you think more about my question? I said, the reality is, sweetheart, that there's nothing in the Bible that says it ceased. In fact, when Yeshua was alive, it was his custom to worship on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. And from everything that I can read, when he comes back in his millennial reign, we're going to be keeping the Sabbath. I said, Isaiah 56 and Isaiah 58 are clearly in a millennial passage of Isaiah, and it's talking about the Sabbath being kept. When it says it's an eternal covenant, that's what he means. Doesn't go away. And how about the Davidic covenant? I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to David my servant, I will establish your seed forever and build up your throne to all generations. Selah. I will establish your seed forever. I have made a covenant with you. We have the Abrahamic, we have the Mosaic, and we have the Davidic. And there we see that these three main covenants are eternal. Okay, I want to take you through a quick overview of the covenants. The nice thing about Keynote, or what some of you call PowerPoint, Keynote is the Apple superior product. The nice thing about our ability to use this kind of projecting on the screen is that I want you to see that when I lay out the covenants, each one extends all the way to the end. In other words, each one is eternal in bringing us to the end. Okay? The first thing I want to note is that the promise is first given to us in Genesis 3:15. Some call it by this Latin term, the proto-evangelium, and it means the gospel beforehand. This is the text that says, saying to Chava, the seed of the serpent will bruise his heel, and he will bruise his head. Right? Okay, so what is this talking about? It's talking about that conflict that began in the garden, where the evil one came and tempted and caused Adam and Chava to rebel against Hashem, against God. And yet there is this promise that there's one coming. And this promise we discover is the promise of the Messiah, Yeshua. And Paul alludes to this when he says in Romans chapter 5, that by one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and death came upon all. And he goes on to say, and through one man righteousness came. And so we have this promise of the coming seed of the woman. Now, the first covenant that we reach in the Bible that actually is called a covenant is the covenant made with Noah. It's called the Noahic covenant. What is the purpose of the Noahic covenant? To preserve mankind. Why is that necessary? It's necessary because a promise has been made that a human being is coming who's going to be the Messiah. We know that it's a human being. Why? Because it's the seed of the woman. It's the offspring of the woman. Women give birth to humans. Okay? Generally speaking. No, I shouldn't have said that. Everyone that is born is born one created in the image of God, human. We know that it's going to be a male because it says, and he will. So what does that mean? It means that mankind must be preserved. What is the promise of the Noahic covenant? Well, first of all, the sign is the rainbow, right? And what does the rainbow say? Never again will God destroy mankind as he destroyed mankind with the flood. It's the preserving of mankind for what ultimate purpose? So that the promise of the Messiah could be realized. What's the next covenant? It's the Abrahamic covenant. This is the covenant that was given to us in Genesis 12 through 15, again in 17, reiterated in 18 and 22, 25, and so forth. What's the purpose of the Abrahamic covenant? To bless all nations. Now you say, well, wait a minute. Wasn't it primarily to bless Israel or to bless the offspring of Abraham? Yes, but the offspring of Abraham is part of the nations. It's one of the nations, right? The ultimate, the zenith of the Abrahamic covenant is the promise to bless all nations. How would we see this literally and literarily? When you discover and look at the 5 times that the Abrahamic covenant is mentioned in the book of Genesis, the promises, the blessings that are listed in the Abrahamic covenant are not always in the same order. Sometimes it says, I will make your name great, and I will multiply your descendants, and so forth. Other times it says, I will multiply your descendants, I will make your name great, I will bless you. They're in different order, except for this. In all listings of the Abrahamic covenant, and in your seed all the nations or all the families of the earth will be blessed is last. It's always put last. Why? It's the capstone. It's where it's all going. It's what God intends to do. To bless all the nations through the seed of Abraham. And of course we know, Paul tells us, that the seed of Abraham is Yeshua. He does a nice little thing little linguistic thing on that. You may not know it, but the word in Hebrew for seed, zerah, is only found one time in the plural. And it's a bit of an anomaly. Every other time it's singular. It's what we call a collective singular. You know, you can have a whole bunch of seed. You can have millions and millions of seed. We don't say millions and millions of seeds. We can just say seed, and it means one, or it means a whole bunch. Paul wants to know, how come it's always singular? He says, that gives us an idea, because the ultimate seed of Abraham is Yeshua. What's the sign of the Abrahamic covenant? Circumcision. Isn't that kind of a strange sign for a covenant? A sign's supposed to be public. This sign is very private. Why is circumcision the sign of the Abrahamic covenant? Think about it just in the scope of how Genesis laid out. Okay? Abraham has promised a son. Son doesn't come. What does Sarah say? Look, we must have a son. How can a covenant made to you, including ownership of land, be given to you if you don't have anybody to inherit it? He said, take my handmaid, take Hagar. Chapter 16. Very quick verbal outline. And Abram went into Hagar. She conceived and she bore a son. And she named his name Ishmael. We've been waiting for a son for how many years? And now the text in 3 words gives it to us in 1 line. Abram has a son. But it's not the right son. Chapter 17, God appears to Abraham again. He says, walk before me, continue to walk before me and be complete, be whole. Abraham says, please, let Ishmael stand before you. He said, no. He's not the one that I chose. And by the way, now I'm giving you the sign of the covenant, and it's circumcision. Is it making more sense? The way that the promised seed would come, the way the promised son would come, is not by the means of normal human procreation. Cut away the flesh, throw it away. This son is going to come by the miraculous hand of God. And to prove that, he waited until Sarah was well beyond the ability to conceive. She no longer was having her monthly period. Right? It was no longer with her according to the way of women, as the Hebrew text says. How can the woman in that state give birth to a child? It's impossible. And what happened? The Malach, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the visitor comes in chapter 18 and says, this time next year, you'll have a son. Sarah says, yeah, you got to be kidding me. Says, okay. Did I hear you laugh? Oh, no, I didn't laugh. Yes, you laughed. Well, no, yes, you laughed. Therefore, they named him what? Laughter, right. Now, what does that tell us? That the promised son comes by above human means to a woman who could not bear a son. It was impossible for her to bear a son. Humanly, physically impossible. Does that remind you of another son? That's because the Abrahamic promise, the Abrahamic covenant, carries that promise in a very special way. Isaac is the one who goes up on the mountain. Isaac is the one who carries the wood as Yeshua carries the wood on the mountain. Isaac is the one who asks the father, his father, you have the wood, you have the fire, where is the lamb? And Abraham is the one who says to Isaac, God will provide for himself a lamb. Paul had to have this in mind in Romans 8 when he said, he who did not spare his son, but rendered him up or gave him up for us all. You see, Isaac was spared. Yeshua's son was not spared. So the purpose of the Abrahamic covenant is to bless all the nations. Circumcision, every time throughout the generations when circumcision was administered, if it had been rightly understood, it would have been a sign of the coming Messiah. And it's very interesting, those of you that have been at a circumcision ceremony, you know that in typical Jewish tradition, there is the seat, there's a special chair there. And does anybody know what that chair is? The chair of? No. It's the chair of Elijah. Why do you have the chair of Elijah at every circumcision in a traditional Jewish setting? Who is Elijah? He is the forerunner of the Messiah. Right? They understood. Is this promised son going to be the Messiah? Is the next generation bringing the Messiah? Waiting. That's the promise of the Abrahamic covenant. What's the next? The Mosaic covenant, Sinai. What's the purpose of the Mosaic covenant? To preserve Israel. Now, I know that's opposite of what others have said. Some have said, well, the purpose of the Mosaic covenant was to show Israel how sinful they were. I could go on and on about that. We've already talked about it. But I can explain it a little more in just a minute. I believe that the Mosaic covenant was given Israel to preserve her. How? Why? Well, look, what does it say in Deuteronomy 4? When you are in the land of the other nations and you're keeping the commandments, what are the other nations going to say? What a wonderful Torah you have. What a great God you must have who has given you such wonderful commandments. It's for your good. What does David say? The Torah of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is, and he goes on and on. By them your servant is warned, and doing them there is great reward. As is often said, an often repeated saying amongst the Jewish people, it is not so much that Israel has kept the Sabbath, but that the Sabbath has kept Israel. What's the sign of the Mosaic covenant? The Shabbat. The Sabbath will be a sign between me and you throughout all your generations. What's the next covenant? The next covenant is the Davidic covenant. It's the kingly covenant. What was the sign? You're going to be surprised. It's talking about the shepherd of Israel. You may not disagree with me, that's fine. You may come up with a better suggestion. But what is the sign of the Davidic covenant? I believe it is Yeshua's resurrection. Say, how is that possible? Read the sermon that Peter spoke at Shavuot in Acts 2. He said, "And we know that the promise made to our father David has been fulfilled." How? In that he raised Yeshua from the dead. The sign that there would be forever one sitting upon the throne of David was proven by the resurrection of the Messiah. Never again to die. You see, not only was the Mosaic covenant to preserve Israel, but the Davidic covenant was to give a king after God's own heart who would shepherd Israel and bring Israel to the place where she was to be in terms of her love and relationship with God Almighty. And the final covenant, the new covenant. What is that? What's going to be the result of that? It's going to renew Israel. It's going to be bringing the house of Israel, the house of Judah back together. It's going to cleanse Israel from her idolatry. If you read the new covenant, what does it say? No longer will they do what they did formerly when they broke my covenant, but they will all be loyal to me. No more idolatry. No more going after other gods. Israel will be cleansed and brought into full relationship with her God. And what's the sign of the new covenant? I believe ultimately it's Israel's revival, as we've said, that all of Israel would be saved. And that brings us then ultimately to the world to come. So can you see how all of these covenants work together to bring about God's full plan, the blessing of all the nations, as well as the salvation of Israel at the end? And ultimately the point in the world to come is to dwell together, right? And forever we will be with the Lord. Yom Shekalosh Shabbat, a day that is all Shabbat. Never ending. No Havdalah. No end of the Shabbat on that one. Now you say, Tim, how does the Noahic covenant fit with the Shabbat as one of the festivals? He said, summer will always come, winter will always come, seed time and harvest. The normal cycle of time will remain. That was one of the promises of the Noahic covenant. I think Pesach fits Abraham. But you say, wait a minute, shouldn't Pesach fit Sinai? No. What does Pesach tell us about our coming out of Egypt? What had to happen in order for, what's the process? God purchases Israel, right? How? Through the blood of the Lamb, right? The Lamb upon the door. He selects Israel. What do you have to do in Passover? You go over and you select a lamb, and then the lamb is slaughtered. Right? What did he do with Abraham? He called Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldees. He chose Abraham to be his own. He paid the price for Abraham to be his own. It sounds like a marriage. A man chooses the woman to be his bride. Then he pays the bride price. But they're not married yet. So I think Passover very much fits with the Abrahamic covenant. What's next? Shavuot. What is Shavuot? It's the ketubah, right? It's the marriage certificate. The Torah is God's written covenant with his bride. We're now husband and wife, just like he says in the new covenant, even though I was a husband to her. What's the next festival? Yom Teruah, right? What does Yom Teruah do? It proclaims the king. Right? When you blow the shofar, it's the proclamation of the king. It's also a reminder to get your life in order because the king is coming. Right? The king is coming. If you need to return, if you need to repent, do it now. What's the next festival? Yom Kippur. And what does Yom Kippur talk about? Cleansing. You see, what happened was that the bride was chosen, the bride was paid for, the marriage took place, right? But then what happened? She was unfaithful. Well, shall we say the betrothal took place? Remember that the ketubah in the ancient history of Israel was written at the time of betrothal, not at the time of actual marriage. Then there was this time of betrothal, and then ultimately marriage. So we have the Sinai, being the ketubah, the betrothal, and what happens between the betrothal and the calling of the shofar that the king is coming. The betrothed bride is unfaithful. Right? Israel went into idolatry. Jeremiah says, on every green hill you play the adulteress. So what happens then when she hears the sound of the shofar? It's a reminder. And then on Yom Kippur, what happens? What's the tradition on Yom Kippur when you come to the shul, besides the fact that you fast all day? What else? What other traditions? Everybody wears white. Yeah. It's a beautiful thing when you come to the shul on Yom Kippur and all the little kids have white on and all the adults, and it's just, you look out on the group and it's just white. Why was it traditional to wear white on Yom Kippur? Well, that's because when the high priest went into the most holy place that one time a year, he didn't have his beautiful vestments on. Go read about it. What did he have? He had his white linen garments on. That was it. What was it to be? A sign of purity, sign of holiness. It's the cleansing. What does Paul say? Husbands, love your wives as the Messiah loves his ecclesia, his gathering, and gave himself for her so that he might, what? Cleanse her. Right? And present her to himself without spot or wrinkle. How is that possible? It's through that cleansing work that comes through the atonement that is applied now to Israel in the new covenant. Right? A new heart, a new approach to God in faith through Yeshua. And then what is the final? Sukkot, dwelling together. Can you see how if we just hold the covenants and all, you could find all kinds of nice sermonic midrash on how you could see how all of these fit together to bring about God's plan. We can talk about this in terms of salvation. There's first, God calls us to himself. And then he justifies us. Why do I put justification with the Abrahamic covenant? Because the Abrahamic covenant is one-sided. It's God alone doing the work. Abraham is asleep when the covenant is ratified. Just like we were dead in our trespasses and sins when the Messiah died for us. We're justified not by what we have done, but because by his mercy he saved us. And then what is the Mosaic covenant or Sinai? It's sanctification. What's the difference between sanctification and justification? We should just have these definitions on the top of our head. Justification means...
That's being made right.
That means declared not guilty, right? Or declared in a positive way to be righteous, to be just.
Sanctification is being made holy.
Okay. Sanctification is the actual change that goes on within us to become more and more and more like Yeshua. Justification is something that happens in a point in time, a declaration by God in the courts of heaven that you are not guilty. You're no longer under his wrath. It's nothing that happens inside of you. It's something that's declared by the Almighty. But sanctification is that ongoing work of the Spirit within us, convicting of us, giving us strength, drawing us to himself, writing the word upon our hearts, and so forth and so on, making us more and more and more like his Son, until we come conform to his Son. And that's exactly what the Torah is to do. The Torah is that sanctifying process. As we contemplate it, as we put these things into our lives, we see how it causes us to be more and more drawn to him. It's interesting. How many prayers do you find in the typical traditional Jewish prayer book? There's a prayer for everything. Right? Some people comment, we have the little prayer in our bathroom right next to the commode. I used to think, well, that's nice, we should have a prayer for everything. But it didn't mean much to me until both of my aged parents finally passed away, and I realized that in their very last days, everything they did was difficult. It was difficult to get dressed. It was difficult to walk from one room to the next. It was difficult to use the restroom. It was difficult for all these things. And I thought to myself, you know what? I have not been faithful in giving thanks to God for the very simple things of life. That's what Torah does to us. Torah says, in all things be thankful. Right? Everything that God allows us to, when I breathe, thank you, Lord, that I can breathe. When I'm able to eat, when I'm able to use the restroom, when I'm able to get up in the morning, when I'm able to go to bed at night, when I'm able to bend over and tie my shoes, I ought to be saying, Lord, thank you. Say, Tim, that's over the edge. I'll tell you something. When you start and I start living a life of thanking God for all things, it changes us to be more and more like Yeshua. We become grateful in ways that we never had. We become grateful for people we weren't grateful for before. That's what sanctification is. And that's what the work of the Spirit with the letter, the Torah written on our hearts, is doing, making us more and more like Yeshua. What does Yom Teruah do? You say, I put the word protect. Why? Because it calls us to the King. It calls us back to where we're supposed to be. Look, what happens when you get too close to danger? You hope that there's something that warns you away from it. Right? Like something on your car that when you're starting to fall asleep and you start, veering off, that there's a beep, 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 beep or something that says, oh, okay, wake up. Yom Teruah says, wake up. Hear the sound of the shofar. Time's near. Is that what the shepherd's to do? Yes. What does the shepherd do? He protects us. What does the king do? Why is it that the Spirit of God grieves? You know what the grieving work of the Spirit of God is in us? It's a warning. Don't fool with that. It's dangerous for you. Don't get near to that. Don't let that be part of your life. Watch out. Tell the truth. We sin and He grieves. And when He grieves, it's a reminder to us that we need to make some changes. What is Yom Kippur? It's to be redeemed, to cleanse us from that filth that we have collected. And then ultimately, we reign with Him. So when we do the study of the covenants, we see that the covenants bring us all the way through God's plan of salvation. They're not opposed to each other. The Abrahamic promise and the promise carried over by the Mosaic covenant are wedded together. Why did God redeem Israel from Egypt? It says, and He remembered His covenant that He made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Exodus and the coming to Sinai and the giving of the Torah is all based upon God being faithful to the promise He made to Abraham. Can you have a place in the world to come if you're justified and not sanctified? It's a trick question, okay? But think about it. Without holiness, literally sanctification, the writer of the Hebrews says no one will see God. So do we earn our way to God by being holy? No. Justification has declared that there's been a change in us, and that change in us is a heart that we desire to do what God wants. Not always, not perfectly, but with the help of the Spirit of God, if we are justified, we will become more and more like Yeshua. We will be sanctified. Justification and sanctification are two sides of a single coin. Why? Because they're two covenants that are wedded together. The one flows into the other and makes each inevitable. What does this mean for our identity? By His own sovereign will, God chose Abraham and the nation that would come from him as His covenant people in order to bless them. God chose individuals from within this chosen nation to be a fruitful remnant in every generation. God chose individuals from all the nations to join the chosen nation Israel in fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham. Our identity begins with God's sovereign choosing. It doesn't begin with our faith. By setting His eternal love upon us, He has brought us into His covenant. Before the world began, we received grace in Yeshua, according to Paul. Whether we are physically related to Jacob or not, if we have come to know God through faith in Yeshua, we are joined together as God's covenant people, Israel. That's our identity. We have a history. We have patriarchs. We're not trying in any way to replace. We have joined a people that God has chosen. Our identity as covenant members is to be lived out as those who are chosen to be in Messiah. Our lives are to be characterized as those who live out the covenant life of Israel. This is why it's so egregious that in the history of the Christian church, the Sabbath was not only jettisoned, but outlawed. Can you imagine? I mean, I've dreamt of this. What would happen? I mean, I don't even want to name any, but let's just take 4 of the greatest radio or internet preachers that are alive, that have the greatest following. I don't know who that would be. Maybe a John MacArthur, maybe a Stanley. I don't know who. Who knows? But those that are preaching, and a lot of people listen to them. And all of a sudden, all 4 of them came out on their stations, on their sermons, and said, I've come to realize that we should be keeping the Sabbath. Can you imagine? What would the Orthodox Jews think? They said, what is going on? What is happening? The sign of our covenant is being observed by hundreds of thousands of people. Can you imagine what that would do? Wow. Is the Messianic movement strong enough to be a light? Can we stop our infighting and get on with doing what God wants us to do? Can we study the Scriptures and live them according to what the Spirit encourages us and leads us to live? And can we be a light that says there is a continuity with the nation of Israel for all of us who are believers in Yeshua? Oh, that it would happen, and it will happen. May we be part of serving God to help that come to pass. We are to walk as Yeshua walked. Our lives are to reflect the covenant blessings promised by God to His chosen people. Our lives are to reflect the fact that the future has invaded the present in the person of our Messiah Yeshua. In the same way that when Yeshua returns, He's going to gather all Israel to Himself. And when we read look at the end of Zechariah. What's going to happen? All the nations are going to come up to Jerusalem and celebrate Sukkot. The nations. Why aren't we doing that now? Let's practice. Let's get ready. This is where we're going. This is where it's going to, this is the goal that we're heading towards. This is seen when Jew and non-Jew worship and serve the Almighty together as equal covenant members. Please, don't get caught up in this movement that's in part of the Messianic congregations that are trying to separate Jew and Gentile. That is so sorrowful to me, and I'm absolutely certain it is to God Himself. He sent His Son to break down a middle wall of partition that separated Jew and non-Jew. Let us never recreate that partition. Only when Jew and non-Jew live out their faith together is God seen to be faithful in His covenant promise. Why? Because He said, in you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. What an interesting experience it was for me to go to Korea a couple times, go to Japan a couple times, and sit in Messianic congregations in Korea and listen to them sing our Messianic songs in Korean. I'm thinking to myself, wow, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Here we have Koreans. Here we have Japanese. Here we have Filipinos. I mean, we've been in the Philippines. Same thing happening there. It's happening in China. Do you know that there are believers in Yeshua in China who are meeting on Shabbat? It's happening in South America. We have requests from Nigeria. We have requests from Honduras. We have requests from other places. We have requests from South Africa all the time. We send a lot of things to South Africa. The Congo. We send things to Australia. What's happening? People are saying, it's time for us to be who we are. His covenant people. We've been created for fellowship with the Almighty. We were created in the image of God. We've been chosen to be part of His covenant people. We've been chosen for blessing. This is our primary identity. Chosen in Messiah to be part of His Am Segulah. I know that in the King James Version this is translated peculiar people. It doesn't mean odd. The word Am Segalah means treasured, special, unique. You know? It's like when Paul was telling me about somebody giving him a guitar. I mean, this is not just any guitar. This is a special guitar. You want to know where you find your identity, where I find my identity? This is where I find it. I'm part of God's chosen people. I'm part of His treasured people. If that doesn't make you feel special, I don't know what will. He sent His Son so that we could be His Am Segalah. One family, one covenant, people, one faith, one Messiah, one Spirit, one Ruach, one purpose, one spiritual food, one identity. Together. If we can live that out, that will be powerful in our communities. I don't care. I don't care if the group that you meet with is 10 people, 15 people, 20 people, doesn't matter. It could be 3 people, whatever. When you're living out this life of identity as God's treasured people, doing it in ways that people look and say, wow, you know, what are you doing this week? Oh, I'm not eating any leaven. Why? It's Passover. You celebrate Passover? Yeah, why? Because I'm part of God's treasured people. What? Wow. Open door, open door, open door. Speak carefully, speak gently, speak lovingly, but let us be that light. So that's the mission of TorahResource, the mission of TorahResource Institute. We're biblically based, we're seeking to honor Yeshua, and we intend to uphold the Torah as God's living and eternal word. Our greater burden is to educate the next generation's leaders for our Messianic communities if the Lord tarries.